The ER doors burst open, and a man built like a weapon walked in without a single wound on him. Every doctor froze. Security reached for their radios, but he walked past all of them, straight toward the quiet nurse everyone in that hospital had learned to overlook. He leaned in close and whispered 4 words meant only for her, and the entire room fell into stunned, disbelieving silence. What happened in the next 60 minutes would tear open a truth she had buried for years. If you're driving home right now, or folding laundry, or just need something to listen to tonight, hit like before we start, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're tuning in from. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because Secrets of Silent Badges brings you a new story every week about the quiet ones nobody sees coming. Welcome back. This one is called Your Father Sent Me Here. Let's begin. You're not paid to think, Donovan. You're paid to fetch things. Detective Roy Callum didn't look up when he said it. He was flipping through a folder, ignoring the nurse standing 3 feet away with a blood pressure cuff in her hand. Claire said nothing. She wrapped the cuff around the old man's arm, squeezed the bulb, watched the needle climb. 142/88, she said. Elevated. I'll flag it for Dr. Ansari. Callum snorted. Flag whatever you want. Just don't slow down my interview. The old man in the bed was Mr. Petrosky, a witness in some robbery case Callum was chasing. Ridgeview Memorial's ER had become his personal interrogation room for the last 2 hours. Claire finished the vitals, logged them, walked away without another word. That was the job now. Absorb it, log it, walk away. 3 years ago, she picked this hospital because it was quiet compared to others. Ridgeview sat in a mid-sized city, 40 minutes from anywhere important. Nobody asked questions here. Nobody looked twice at a nurse who kept her head down and her sleeves pulled long, even in July. He's been like that all shift, Maria whispered, falling into step beside her. Maria Alvarez had trained Claire on her first week. Now she just watched her sometimes like she was trying to solve a puzzle she'd never admit to noticing. He's like that every shift, Claire said. You ever want to tell him to shove it? Every day. Maria laughed and moved on to her next patient. Claire kept walking. Bay 4 needed restocking. Bay 6 needed a dressing change. The whiteboard at the nurse's station was a wall of names and complaints. Chest pain, fall, laceration, overdose. Dehydration. Ordinary Tuesday. Ordinary noise. Claire liked ordinary. Ordinary meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. She restocked gauze in Bay 4 with her back straight and her shoulders curved forward, a posture she'd practiced so long it no longer felt like acting. Head slightly down, eyes soft, unfocused, the way people looked when they were tired and underpaid and didn't want trouble. Nobody at Ridgeview knew what those shoulders used to carry. Nobody knew that the hand stocking gauze had once pulled a wounded combat controller across 60 meters of open ground under fire, calling in air support with a broken collarbone and a radio held together with tape. They knew Claire Donovan. Quiet, competent, kept to herself. Good with IVs, better with kids, terrible at office gossip. They did not know Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan, United States Air Force, call sign Wraith 6, Combat Control Team, 9 years of service. 2 continents of scars she never explained. She had buried that name the day her father disappeared. Colonel Frank Donovan, Special Forces, a man who taught his daughter Morse code before he taught her to ride a bike, who ran her through land navigation drills on Saturday mornings while other kids watched cartoons. A man who vanished on a mission nobody would name, leaving behind a folded flag that was never actually a funeral, because there was never actually a body. Claire left the military 11 months after that, not because she stopped believing in the work, because she couldn't stand being asked one more time by one more well-meaning officer, "Any word on your dad?" So she became a nurse. She became nobody. She became invisible. Except invisible was getting harder to maintain today. "Bay 4's out of tourniquets," said Jordan, one of the newer techs, poking his head around the curtain. "Second cart, bottom drawer," Claire said without turning around. "How do you always know that?" "I stocked the carts." Jordan grinned and disappeared. Claire allowed herself half a breath of stillness. The overhead radio at the nurse's station crackled. A burst of dispatch chatter, ambulance inbound, nothing urgent, ETA 8 minutes. The static made her hands twitch. It always did. A small tremor, barely visible, gone in 2 seconds. Old wiring, misfiring. A sound her body still associated with something it refused to name in daylight. She pressed her palm flat against the counter until it stopped. "You good?" Maria asked, passing by again. Fine, Claire said. Coffee's just wearing off. Down the hall, Callum's voice rose again, sharp and impatient. Drilling Mr. Petrosky about a description he'd already given twice. Dr. Ansari tried to intervene, gently reminding the detective that his patient needed rest. Callum waved him off without looking at him either. When I need medical advice, Doc, I'll ask for it. Ansari's jaw tightened. He caught Claire's eye across the hallway and gave the smallest shake of his head, the universal signal for men like Callum. Claire returned it. She'd worked with 100 versions of Roy Callum in her old life. Officers who mistook volume for authority. The difference was, back then, she'd outranked most of them eventually. Here, she was just staff, Fetch-It Donovan, below the line where anyone had to listen. She used to hate that feeling. Now she used it as camouflage. The shift wore on the way shifts did. A child with a fractured wrist, crying more from fear than pain, calmed by Claire's steady voice and a joke about superhero casts. An elderly woman with chest tightness, who turned out to be anxiety, not a heart attack, and who held Claire's hand the whole time like it was a life raft. A construction worker with a nail through his palm who nearly fainted at the sight of his own X-ray. Ordinary. All of it. Blessedly ordinary. Between patients, Claire found 4 minutes to sit in the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee. Jordan was there too, scrolling through his phone, legs stretched out under the table. Can I ask you something weird? He said. You're going to anyway. You ever get scared? Like actual scared? I've seen you handle a seizure, a code, a guy screaming about spiders on his arms. Nothing moves you. Claire turned her cup slowly on the table. Everybody's scared of something. What are you scared of? She thought about the answer she couldn't give him. The sound of a specific radio frequency. The particular silence that came after an explosion, right before the screaming started. A phone call that never came. From a father who never came home. Running out of coffee, she said instead. Jordan laughed, satisfied, and went back to his phone. Claire finished her cup in silence, listening to the hum of the vending machine, letting herself have 4 minutes of nothing before the noise started again. She thought briefly about the last letter her father had sent her, handwritten, mailed from an APO address that no longer existed by the time she tried to write back. 3 sentences. Take care of your mother's garden. Trust the people who earn it slowly. I'll see you when I see you. That had been 6 years ago. Nobody had ever confirmed he was dead. Nobody had ever produced a body, a casket, a single verified fact. Just silence, filed under classified, stamped and closed. She had built an entire life out of that silence, a life with soft shoulders and long sleeves and a name nobody questioned. The break room door swung open. Donovan, Bay 2 needs a dressing change, Maria called. And Callum's asking for you specifically now. God knows why. Claire's stomach tightened, just slightly. Me specifically? Something about Vidal's paperwork. Probably just wants someone to yell at. She stood, straightened her scrubs, and let the soft posture settle back over her shoulders like a coat she'd worn so long it no longer felt heavy. Callum was waiting by Mr. Petrosky's bed, folder open, pen tapping an impatient rhythm against the metal bed rail. There you are. I need you to confirm what time this man's vitals were taken. My report needs a timestamp. It's on the chart, Detective. I know it's on the chart. I want to hear it from you. Claire pulled up the record on the wall terminal, kept her voice level. 3:52 p.m. Same as it says right there. Callum studied her for a second too long, the way men like him sometimes did when a woman answered without flinching. You always this cooperative? I'm always this busy. He almost smiled at that. The closest thing to warmth he'd shown all shift, then covered it by turning back to Petrosky with another question about the color of a jacket from a robbery 3 weeks old. Claire walked away before he could invent a reason to keep her there. She caught Dr. Ansari at the nurse's station, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. Long one, he said. They're all long ones. You ever think about days off? I think about them the way other people think about lottery tickets. He huffed something like a laugh, tired but genuine, and went back to his charting. Claire liked Ansari. He was one of the few doctors at Ridgeview who treated nurses like colleagues instead of furniture, who said please, who remembered names of patients' spouses. If she ever slipped, even slightly, She suspected he'd be the one to notice first. At 6:40 p.m., Claire clocked a break coming, 40 minutes until shift change. She allowed herself to imagine the walk to her car, the quiet drive home, the 2 fingers of bourbon she'd allow herself on a Thursday, the 11 o'clock silence of an apartment with no one in it, and nothing to explain. That was when the ambulance bay doors did not open. The front doors did. They didn't slide open the way they usually did, slow and polite, sensor-triggered. They were shoved hard from the outside, swinging wide enough to bang against the rubber stoppers on the wall. Every head in the waiting room turned. A man stepped through. He was enormous, not heavy-set, but built the way certain trees are built, wide and rooted and permanent. 6'3" easily, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe look narrow. He wore a dark civilian jacket, tailored despite everything, and boots that had clearly walked through worse places than a hospital lobby. No blood on him, no limp, no wound anyone could see. He was not hurt. He was hunting for something. The security guard near the entrance, a heavy-set retiree named Pete, who mostly dealt with drunk patients and lost visitors, stood up out of his chair. "Sir, you need to check in at the desk." The man didn't look at him, didn't slow down. It wasn't rudeness. It was focus. The kind of focus that made everyone else in the room feel like furniture. He walked past triage, past the intake nurse calling his name. "Sir, sir." Past 2 techs wheeling an empty gurney who stepped back without being asked, the way people step back from something they can't name but instinctively respect. Callum, still in the hallway with his folder, caught the movement from the corner of his eye and turned. His hand moved, unconsciously, toward his hip. Hey, this is a restricted area." The man didn't even register him. He crossed the ER floor in maybe 15 strides, weaving past a crash cart and a wheelchair, his eyes scanning bays the way a man reads a map he's already memorized. Every doctor within sight had stopped moving. Dr. Ansari stood frozen mid-sentence, a chart still open in his hand. Maria's mouth was slightly open. Even Jordan, 24 years old and generally unshakable, had backed against the wall. The man's eyes landed on Claire, and stopped. Claire was standing at the med cart in Bay 3, a syringe in one hand, in the middle of drawing up a dose from Mr. Petrosky. She felt the room shift before she understood why. She looked up. Their eyes met. Something in her chest went very still, very fast, the way it used to before a mission brief that was about to change everything. He walked straight to her. Stopped less than 2 feet away, closer than any stranger should stand. But she didn't step back, because some old part of her recognized his stance before her mind caught up with a name. He leaned down, just slightly, and spoke low enough that only she could hear it. "Your father sent me here." The syringe in Claire's hand did not move. Her face did not move, but somewhere behind her ribs, 3 years of careful invisibility cracked straight down the middle. Behind them, the entire ER had gone completely silent. Nobody moved first. That was the strange part. For almost 4 full seconds, the only sound in the department was the soft beep of a monitor in Bay 2 and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Then Callum broke it, because men like Callum could never stand silence. They didn't create themselves. "Hands where I can see them!" His weapon wasn't drawn yet, but his hand was on it, and his voice had the particular pitch of a man who'd watched too many training videos and never actually fired his sidearm outside a range. The big man didn't turn around right away. He straightened up first, slow, deliberate, giving Claire one last look, a look she couldn't read except that it wasn't a threat. It was almost an apology. Then he turned to face Callum. "I'm not armed," he said. His voice was low, even, unbothered. "You can pat me down if it makes you feel better, detective. Don't tell me what I can do." Callum's hand tightened on the grip. "Who are you? What did you say to her?" "That's between me and the nurse." "Like hell it is. You just barged into a hospital." "Roy." Dr. Ansari's voice, quiet but firm, cutting through. "Let's not do this in the middle of the department." Callum ignored him, same as always. He took a step closer to the stranger, chest puffed, playing a role he'd clearly practiced in a mirror somewhere. "I asked you a question." "Marcus Voss," the man said, flat, unafraid. "Retired. I flew a long way to deliver a message. That's all this is. Retired from what? Voss's eyes flicked, just once, toward Claire. A silent question. Do you want me to answer that here? Claire's mouth had gone dry. Her hands, still holding the syringe, were perfectly steady. The tremor from earlier long gone, replaced by something colder and more familiar. Old training rising up through years of practice softness. He's not a threat, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Detective, he hasn't done anything. Let him go. He shoved through a restricted door. He walked through an open lobby, Claire said. That's not a crime. Callum's eyes narrowed at her, like he was noticing her, really noticing her, for the first time in 3 years. Since when do you have opinions about my investigations, Donovan? Before Claire could answer, the radio at the nurse's station cracked to life. Dispatch calling out over the general channel, and this time, it wasn't routine. All units, shots fired, ambulance bay, Ridgeview Memorial. Repeat, shots fired. The words hit the room like a physical wave. Pete, the security guard, fumbled for his own radio. Maria grabbed the intake nurse's arm on instinct. Somewhere behind them, a woman in the waiting room screamed. Voss's head turned sharply toward the ambulance bay doors, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something crossed his face that looked almost like alarm. They followed me, he said, low, mostly to himself. Damn it, they followed me here. Who followed you? Callum demanded, weapon finally clearing the holster, though he still didn't seem to know where to point it. People who don't want your father's name connected to what he found, Voss said, low, meant for Claire, though the whole room heard it now. I came to warn you before they got here first. Looks like I didn't move fast enough. What did he find? Claire asked. Her voice had dropped, quiet and sharp, a tone Maria had never once heard her use. Not here, Voss said. Not with an audience. Everything gets said in front of me, Callum snapped, jabbing the air with his weapon for emphasis. This is my scene now. It's a hospital lobby, detective, Voss said, without any heat at all, which somehow made it worse for Callum than if he'd shouted. It stopped being your scene the moment you walked in armed and started pointing that thing at unarmed civilians. Callum's face went red. He opened his mouth to answer. Nobody answered him, because that was when the ambulance bay doors slammed open for the second time in 10 minutes, and this time there was blood. 2 paramedics burst through pushing a gurney, one of them pressing both hands hard against a young man's chest, dark red already soaking through blue gloves and spreading across a torn jacket. Gunshot wound, left chest, entry only, no exit, patients tacky and dropping. We need a trauma bay now. The department detonated into motion. Dr. Ansari was moving before the sentence finished, shouting orders, techs scrambling for Bay 1, Maria clearing a path through the crowd of stunned bystanders. Callum spun toward the noise, gun still half raised, clearly unsure whether to chase the mystery of Voss or respond to an actual emergency happening 10 feet away. Claire's training took over before her conscious mind caught up. She was moving toward Bay 1 almost before she realized she'd set the syringe down. Her eyes swept the incoming patient in half a second. Young man, early 20s. Gray pallor already setting in, breathing fast and shallow, a thin sheen of sweat despite the cold sweep of the AC. Not the shooter, a bystander. Wrong place, wrong 10 minutes. Talk to me, Ansari called, voice tight, as they transferred the patient onto the trauma bed. BP's 88 over 52 and falling, a tech called out. Heart rate 134. Sats dropping, 91%. Claire's eyes moved to the cardiac monitor the second it was hooked up. She watched the waveform, watched the numbers, and something in her chest went cold in a very different way than fear. Muffled heart sounds, falling blood pressure, jugular veins standing out at the patient's neck like cords, even from 3 feet away, tachycardia climbing instead of correcting with the fluids already running wide open. She had seen this exact combination once before, in a place she never spoke about, on a body she had kept alive for 11 minutes with nothing but a 14-gauge needle and a memory of a manual she'd read years earlier. Beck's triad. All 3 signs, right in front of her. Cardiac tamponade, blood filling the sac around the heart, squeezing it until it couldn't beat properly anymore. Left untreated, that heart would stop in minutes, not hours. Dr. Ansari, she started. I see it, Ansari said, already reaching for an ultrasound probe. Hands moving fast, but not fast enough, sweat beading at his hairline. He wasn't a trauma surgeon. He was a competent, overworked ER attending who had done maybe 2 of these procedures in his entire career, both of them years ago, both of them under supervision. "Get me cardiothoracic on the phone," he barked at a tech. "Now." "They're 20 minutes out, doctor. There's an accident on Route 9. Then get me anyone." "Dr. Whitfield's in a meeting downtown," Maria called back, phone pressed to her ear, panic starting to edge into her voice. "He's not answering." Jordan stood frozen near the crash cart, staring at the patient's chest, at the blood already soaking through a second set of gauze pads. "I've never seen anyone crash this fast," he said, mostly to himself. "This isn't right. This isn't a normal gunshot wound." He was right, though he didn't know why yet. A normal gunshot wound to the chest bled. It didn't drop a blood pressure this fast unless something else was happening underneath the skin, something the human eye couldn't see without a machine to translate it. Claire already knew. She'd known from the second she saw the neck veins. "BP's 70/40, the monitor tech called, voice rising in pitch. "He's crashing. 20 minutes. This patient didn't have 20 minutes. He had, by Claire's fast, cold calculation, maybe 4. Ansari's hands were shaking, just slightly, as he positioned the ultrasound probe against the patient's chest, searching for the right window, precious seconds bleeding away while he adjusted and readjusted the angle. Callum, still standing near the doorway with his weapon still drawn, watching the chaos with the expression of a man completely out of his depth, shouted toward Voss. "You did this! Whoever you're running from did this!" "I didn't do anything," Voss said, low, watching Claire instead of the detective, watching her hands, watching her face. "But she can." "She's a nurse," Callum snapped. Voss didn't answer him. He just kept watching Claire, the way a man watches a door he already knows is about to open. On the monitor, the patient's blood pressure dropped again, 62/38. Ansari looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, his eyes met Claire's. And in that fraction of a second, something passed between them that had nothing to do with hospital hierarchy and everything to do with a doctor who knew deep down that his hands weren't going to make it in time. "Claire," he said. Not Donovan, not nurse. Her first name, quiet, almost pleading. "Talk me through it, please." The room seemed to hold its breath. 3 years of curved shoulders straightened in under a second. Claire stepped forward before she'd finished deciding to. "Move the probe 2 centimeters left, subxiphoid window. Angle it toward the left shoulder." Ansari blinked, startled by the certainty in her voice, but he moved the probe. The image on the little gray screen resolved. A dark, ominous ring of fluid choking the space around a heart that was struggling to fill between beats. "There," Claire said. "Effusion, at least 4 centimeters. That's why he's not responding to fluids. You need to drain it now or he arrests in under 2 minutes." "I've done this twice and never like this," Ansari said, hands not quite steady. "Talk me through the approach." Claire looked at the monitor, looked at the patient's face, already going the particular shade of gray she remembered from a dust road she never named out loud. Looked at Ansari's hands. They weren't going to make it in time. Not like this. "Give me the kit," she said. "I'll guide your hands, or I'll do it myself. Your call, doctor. We have maybe 90 seconds. Ansari didn't hesitate. 3 years of watching her handle chaos with unnatural calm had bought her exactly enough trust for this one impossible moment. "Do it," he said, and stepped back half a pace, offering the needle. Claire's hands, which had trembled at the sound of radio static 2 hours earlier, did not tremble now. She snapped on sterile gloves in 2 motions. Prepped the site below the sternum with practiced speed. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Positioned the long cardiac needle at a precise angle toward the left shoulder, exactly the way she'd been trained to do it in a tent with sand blowing sideways and a radio screaming in her ear. "Suction ready," she said, voice flat and commanding, a voice nobody in that room had ever heard her use. "Someone call out his pressure every 15 seconds. 58/30, the tech said, voice cracking. Claire advanced the needle. Slow, controlled, aspirating gently as she went, watching the syringe for the telltale flash of dark blood that would confirm she'd reached the pericardial sac and not the heart muscle itself. The room had gone utterly silent, except for the monitor's frantic beeping. Dark blood flashed into the syringe. "There," she said, quiet now. almost to herself. She withdrew slowly, drawing off fluid in careful increments, watching the monitor with the total focus of someone who had done this before, in conditions infinitely worse than a climate-controlled trauma bay. 60 milliliters. 80. The monitor's alarm, which had been screaming for the last minute, began to slow. "Pressure's coming up," the tech said, disbelief cracking through her voice. 82 over 50. 90 over 58. "Keep going," Ansari breathed, staring at Claire like he'd never seen her before in his life. Because he hadn't. Not really. Claire drained another 20 milliliters, watched the heart's rhythm steady on the monitor, watched the patient's color shift from gray towards something closer to human. Then she withdrew the needle completely, capped it, and stepped back, snapping off her gloves with the same unhurried precision she'd used to put them on. "BP's 104 over 66, the tech said. "Heart rate's coming down. 98, 91. Nobody spoke. The trauma bay. 30 seconds ago, a controlled scream of chaos had gone completely, impossibly quiet. Ansari stood with the ultrasound probe still in his hand, staring at Claire as though she'd just performed a magic trick in front of an audience that didn't believe in magic. "How?" he said finally. Just that. One word. Claire looked down at her own hands. For the first time in 3 years, standing in that hospital, she didn't try to make them look smaller than they were. "Emergency medicine," she said. "You pick things up." "That wasn't a pickup," Ansari said quietly. "That was a cardiothoracic fellows procedure, under fire conditions. I've seen surgeons choke on that exact call." Behind them, near the doorway, Marcus Voss exhaled something that might have been a laugh, or might have been relief, or might have been both. "There she is," he murmured, quiet enough that only Claire heard it. "I told them you never really left." Callum, weapon finally lowered, stood frozen near the entrance to the bay, staring at Claire with an expression that had shifted in the space of 90 seconds from suspicion to something closer to confusion. He'd spent 3 years treating her like furniture. He'd just watched furniture perform a procedure that saved a man's life in under 2 minutes flat. "Who are you?" he asked. Not an accusation this time. A real question. Claire didn't answer him. She looked instead at Voss, who was watching her with the careful patience of a man who had waited a long time to say what he came to say, and who understood that the ER floor, surrounded by strangers and a detective with a gun, was not the place to say it. "We need to talk," Claire said. Her voice had changed. Steadier. Colder. A voice that belonged to someone else entirely. "Somewhere private." "That's why I'm here," Voss said. Maria, standing a few feet away with her hand still pressed over her own mouth, looked between Claire and the stranger, and then at the patient on the table, whose monitor now showed a heartbeat as steady as anyone's in that building. "Claire," she said, quiet, almost afraid of the answer. "What was that?" Claire didn't answer that question either, not yet. Because across the room, Dr. Whitfield, the ER's medical director, a tall, graying man who rarely left his office during a shift, was standing in the doorway, having clearly witnessed the last 30 seconds of the save. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between admiration and alarm. "Nurse Donovan," he said slowly, "my office, now, and bring your friend." Behind him, a hospital security radio crackled with a report Claire hadn't expected yet. A description of a vehicle circling the parking lot, engine running, no plates visible, sitting exactly where an ambulance bay camera could see it and nowhere else. Whoever had followed Marcus Voss to Ridgeview Memorial hadn't left. They were still outside, waiting. Maria touched Claire's arm, gently, the way she might touch someone she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. "Whatever this is," she said quietly, "be careful." "Okay?" "I will," Claire said, and meant it, though the words felt strange in her mouth. Spoken in a voice that belonged less to the nurse Maria had trained, and more to someone who used to give orders in places with no names on any map. Ansari was still staring at the monitor, at the steady rhythm Claire had pulled back from the edge of nothing, and when he finally looked up at her, his expression had settled into something quieter than shock. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Go," he said. "I've got him stable. Whitfield's waiting. Go find out what's happening before it finds you first." Claire nodded once, sharp, efficient, nothing like the tired shrug she usually gave at the end of an order. She looked at Voss, After you, she said. And for the first time in 3 years, Claire Donovan felt the old, familiar pull of a mission clock starting to run. Dr. Whitfield's office was small, glass-walled, and smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork. He shut the door behind Claire and Voss, then stood there for a moment with his hand still on the handle, as if he needed it to hold himself steady. "I've run this ER for 11 years, he said finally. "I have never seen anything like what just happened out there." "It's not something I plan to demonstrate," Claire said. "I know how to place a pericardial needle," Whitfield said. "I've done it exactly once, in a simulation lab, under supervision, and I sweated through my shirt. You did it in under 2 minutes with a detective pointing a gun at the man standing next to you." He looked at Voss. "Who are you exactly?" "A friend of her father's." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give you in a hospital office with the blinds open," Voss said, glancing toward the window. Toward the parking lot beyond it. "There's a car out there that's been circling for 20 minutes. Dark sedan, no plates. I'd feel better if we moved this conversation somewhere it can't see in." Whitfield's face paled slightly. He walked to the window himself, hands in his pockets, and looked down at the lot for a long moment. The sedan was still there, parked at an angle that gave a clear sightline to the ambulance bay and the east entrance both. Whoever was driving it understood hospital layouts better than a casual observer should. He rubbed a hand across his face, the exhaustion of 11 years running this department suddenly visible in every line of it. "I run a hospital," he said quietly, half to himself. "Not a war." "How long have you known him?" Whitfield asked, nodding at Voss without taking his eyes off the parking lot. "Her father, I mean." 19 years, Voss said. "We came up together. Different units, same schoolhouse, same instructors. He talked about his daughter more than any operator I ever served with talked about anybody. Said she was smarter than him by the time she was 12. Said she'd figure out the family business whether he wanted her to or not." Claire's throat tightened at that, an old ache she hadn't let herself feel in years. "He never told me that. He wasn't a man who said things twice," Voss said, something gentle in his voice now, the flatness from the ER long gone. "He said them once, to the people he trusted, and expected you to remember." Whitfield turned from the window, reaching for the phone on his desk. "I'll call hospital security." "Call them," Claire said. "But detective, understand this. Whoever's in that car isn't here for the hospital. They're here for him." She nodded at Voss. "And possibly for me now, since I just made it obvious I know how to stop them." Whitfield lowered the phone slightly. "Nurse Donovan, 3 years I've had you on staff. Your file says you did 2 years of community college nursing courses before certification. It does not say anything about advanced trauma procedures. It does not say anything about—" He gestured vaguely at the air, at the memory of what he'd just watched, whatever that was. "My file is accurate," Claire said, "as far as it goes." "And how far does it not go?" Claire looked at Voss. He gave the smallest nod, the kind that said, "It's your call, not mine." 9 years, Air Force, Claire said. "Combat control team. I coordinated air support on the ground, under fire, in places I'm not going to name in an office with windows. I left the service almost 4 years ago. I became a nurse because it let me use the parts of that job I didn't hate, keeping people alive, and let go of the parts I couldn't carry anymore." Whitfield sat down slowly in his chair, like his knees had made the decision without asking his brain first. "Combat control," he repeated. That's special operations." "Yes, and the procedure you just did is something I've done before, under worse conditions than a trauma bay with a nervous but competent doctor standing next to me." She glanced at Voss again, feeling the next question coming before Whitfield asked it. "Why hide it?" Claire's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Because the people who knew what I used to be always wanted to talk about my father instead of me. Because civilian life doesn't know what to do with someone who's seen combat and still wants to hold a stranger's hand while they cry about a broken wrist. Because invisible was easier." Whitfield studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss. "And you? Why does a man with no visible injuries walk through my ER like he owns it, whisper something in a nurse's ear, and trigger an incident with a police detective and a possible surveillance vehicle in my parking lot?" Voss exhaled slowly. This was the part he'd been avoiding since the moment he stepped through the doors. "Because 6 days ago," he said, "I found proof that Colonel Frank Donovan is still alive." The room went very quiet. Claire didn't move, didn't breathe for a second. The words landed somewhere deep, somewhere she'd sealed off years ago behind gauze and IV bags and a job that asked no questions. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice had lost all its earlier steadiness. "He's been gone 6 years. There was never a body," Voss said, gently now, none of the earlier flatness in his voice. "Because there was never supposed to be one. He wasn't killed on that mission, Claire. He was captured. And for 6 years, certain people decided it was easier to let his own daughter believe he was dead than admit the operation that took him was one they never should have run." "Who decided that?" Claire's voice had an edge now, sharp enough to cut. "People who are very good at making inconvenient truths disappear," Voss said. "People who, as of 6 days ago, know that I found the file that proves it. Which is why there's a car outside this hospital right now, and why it isn't going to leave until either I'm dead, or the truth is somewhere they can't bury it again." Claire sat down slowly in the chair across from Whitfield's desk, her legs suddenly unwilling to hold the weight of the last 6 years all at once. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? If you knew 6 days ago?" Voss's face tightened, the first crack in his own composure since he'd walked through the ER doors. "Because I spent those 6 days making sure it was real, before I let myself put that hope in front of you. I've watched hope get used as a weapon before, Claire. I wasn't going to hand you a maybe. I needed a certainty, or nothing at all. And now you have a certainty." "Now I have a certainty," Voss said, "and a target on my back for finding it. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry it arrived with gunfire instead of a phone call. That's not how I wanted to tell you." Whitfield looked between them, out of his depth in a conversation that had nothing to do with medicine anymore. This is a matter for the FBI, for someone, not for my ER." "I agree," Voss said. "Which is why I already called someone on my way in. She should be arriving within the hour. Until then, we have a problem parked in your lot, and a police detective outside this office who still thinks I'm the criminal." As if summoned by the words, the door burst open without a knock. Callum stood in the frame, weapon holstered now, but his face still flushed with the particular fury of a man who'd been humiliated in front of witnesses and hadn't figured out yet how to spend the anger. "Somebody want to explain to me what the hell is going on?" he demanded. "Because I've got a vehicle in the lot that hasn't moved in half an hour, a civilian who won't answer basic questions, and a nurse who apparently used to do things they don't teach in nursing school." "Close the door, detective," Whitfield said quietly, and something in his tone, the first real authority he'd shown all conversation, made Callum actually do it. "Sit down," Whitfield continued, "because you're about to hear something that's going to change how you look at this hospital, and at her, for the rest of your career." Callum's eyes flicked to Claire. For the first time since she'd known him, there was something other than contempt in the way he looked at her. It might have been suspicion. It might have been the beginning of respect. It was too early to tell which one would win. He sat, arms crossed, jaw tight, clearly bracing himself to disbelieve whatever came next. 3 years I've watched you hand me paperwork and vitals without a single complaint," he said to Claire, almost accusing. "You're telling me that's not who you actually are?" "It's part of who I am," Claire said. "Just not all of it. The part you saw was real. I really do care about the patients on this floor. I really did want to disappear into an ordinary life. I just wasn't given the option to stay disappeared today." Callum studied her, some old certainty visibly cracking behind his eyes. "And the rest of it? The part I didn't see." Outside the glass wall of the office, down 2 floors and across the parking lot, the dark sedan's engine finally cut off. A door opened. Someone stepped out. The man who got out of the sedan moved like someone used to being underestimated. Mid-40s, unremarkable jacket, the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd on purpose. He didn't rush toward the entrance. He walked, slow and casual, hands visible, the posture of someone who had done this exact approach 100 times before and knew that speed drew eyes. Claire saw him first. Through the security feed, Whitfield pulled up on his desktop after Voss insisted. A woman in a plain gray suit had arrived minutes earlier, badge clipped to her belt, and was now leaning over the desk beside them, her eyes fixed on the same monitor. "That's not police," Voss said. "That's Marchetti, contractor. I've seen his file. He doesn't miss." "Miss what?" Callum asked, though the tightness in his voice said he already suspected the answer. Targets, Voss said simply. Kessler leaned over the desk, watching the grainy feed with a professional's eye. He'll case the building before he commits to an entrance. Contractors like Marchetti don't rush. He'll want to know where the cameras are, where security's stationed, which doors get foot traffic and which ones don't. She glanced at Claire. You know this profile. I've hunted men like him before, Claire said. Just from the other direction. On the screen, Marchetti paused near the ambulance bay, apparently checking his phone, though his eyes moved methodically across the building's exterior, cameras, sight lines, the placement of the one board security guard smoking near the loading dock. He was patient, he was thorough, and he had clearly done this before, more than once, in places far less forgiving than a suburban hospital. Claire's mind was already 3 steps ahead, running old calculations she hadn't run in years. Exits, sight lines, choke points, civilians in the blast radius of any possible confrontation. Ridgeview Memorial had 4 entrances. 2 were currently staffed by security guards who had never handled anything more dangerous than an intoxicated visitor. The other 2 were unmonitored after 6 p.m. He'll come in through the east stairwell, Claire said, not the lobby. Too many witnesses now, and he knows we've made him. He'll want a quiet route to whoever he thinks is the target. Which is me, Voss said. Which is both of us now, Claire said. I'm the one who just proved I'm not just a nurse. Whitfield looked physically ill. I need to call an evacuation. Get everyone out. No, Claire said, sharper than she meant to. An evacuation puts 200 frightened people into hallways and stairwells at the exact moment a professional with a weapon is moving through this building. That's how people die, Doctor. Not from staying put. From panicking into the open. Then what do we do? Callum asked. It was the first genuine question he'd asked her all day, stripped of contempt, stripped of rank, just a man who'd realized he was out of his depth and was finally willing to admit it. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 hours earlier. You're going to help me, she said. Because right now, you're the only person in this building with a badge and a weapon who isn't a civilian. Can you follow instructions without arguing? Callum's jaw tightened, old pride flaring for just a second. Then it faded, replaced by something steadier. Tell me what to do. Lock this office, Claire said to Whitfield. Get on the hospital PA. Announce a code for a facility issue, not a lockdown, nothing that sounds like a threat. Ask all non-essential staff to remain in current rooms. That clears the hallways without triggering panic. Whitfield nodded, already reaching for the phone. Voss, you're the target. You're staying visible enough that he commits to a path, but far enough back that if this goes wrong, it's me between you and him, not you exposed in the open. I don't need protecting, Voss said. I know, Claire said. But you need to still be alive when the person you called finishes her drive here, so do what I say. Voss almost smiled, the ghost of something that looked like pride. Copy that. Claire turned to Callum. You're going to cover the east stairwell door from the 2nd floor landing. Not the ground floor, the 2nd floor. He'll expect anyone waiting for him to be at ground level. You'll have the angle on him before he clears the stairs. And you? I'll be in the stairwell itself, Claire said. Waiting. Alone? Against a professional? I've done worse with less, Claire said, and something in the flatness of her voice told him not to argue further. She moved through the supply closet down the hall first, gathering what she needed with the efficient calm of someone assembling a kit she'd assembled 1,000 times before, just with different materials. A fire extinguisher, heavy enough to matter, light enough to swing fast. A roll of medical tubing, strong enough to bind wrists in a pinch. A crash cart's defibrillator paddles, disconnected from their unit, because a jolt of stored current through the right contact point could drop a grown man to his knees for exactly as long as she needed. She moved to the stairwell with her shoulders straight for the first time in 3 years. Detection came first. She stood in the shadow beneath the landing for almost a full minute before she heard it. The faint scuff of a boot sole against concrete, deliberately soft, a professional's step. Marchetti was good. Most people wouldn't have caught it at all. Claire had spent 9 years listening for exactly that sound in places where missing it meant somebody didn't come home. Preparation took only seconds after that. She shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet, extinguisher held low and angled, breath slow and even, every old instinct sliding back into place like a key finding its lock. She thought, briefly, of her father's voice from a Saturday morning decades ago. Composure first, speed second, force only when the first two run out. The waiting took 4 minutes in total, long enough for her pulse to settle into the old rhythm, slow and even. The rhythm she'd trained her body into years ago, because panic wasted oxygen a person might need later. She positioned herself in the shadow beneath the second-floor landing, invisible to anyone coming up from below, exactly the way she used to wait in doorways that weren't hospital stairwells. The door at the bottom of the stairs opened softly. Careful. Practiced. Marchetti moved like water, silent on the concrete steps, a compact pistol held low and ready. He scanned the stairwell in one smooth motion, checking angles, checking blind spots, missing the one directly above him because he was looking for a threat at eye level, not one waiting patiently in shadow with a fire extinguisher raised. Claire let him climb 4 more steps, then she moved. The extinguisher came down in a short, controlled arc, catching his gun arm before he could bring the weapon to bear. The pistol clattered down the stairs. Marchetti recovered fast, faster than most men would, pivoting into a strike aimed at her ribs, and Claire took it on her forearm instead of her chest, absorbing the impact the way she'd been taught to absorb 100 impacts before, redirecting his momentum instead of fighting it head-on. He was good, trained. But he was trained to eliminate a surprised civilian, not to fight someone who moved like she'd been doing this her entire adult life. Claire drove her elbow into his sternum, felt the air leave him in a short grunt, followed with a strike to the side of his knee that folded his leg sideways. He went down hard against the railing, one hand scrabbling for a second weapon she hadn't accounted for. A small blade tucked into his boot, and for a fraction of a second, the fight tilted back toward him. Claire dropped the extinguisher and closed the distance instead of retreating, the way she'd been taught, because distance was exactly what a knife wanted. She caught his wrist before the blade cleared its sheath, twisted hard, felt something in his hand give way with a sound she didn't let herself think about, and the knife skittered across the landing and down into darkness. Marchetti grunted in pain but didn't stop fighting, throwing his weight forward, trying to drive her back into the railing. Claire let him come, stepped sideways at the last instant, and used his own momentum to send him crashing face first into the concrete wall. He went down hard against the railing, and Claire was on him before he could recover, wrenching his free arm behind his back, driving her knee into the space between his shoulder blades. "Federal officer requesting backup," Claire called up the stairwell, voice utterly level, though every part of her body was still humming with adrenaline. "Detective, he's contained." Callum came down the stairs 2 at a time, weapon drawn, and stopped dead at the sight of a hospital nurse kneeling on a professional contractor's back like she'd done it 100 times. Her breathing barely elevated, her hands perfectly steady on his wrists. "You—" Callum started, and then simply stopped, because there was nothing in his experience that had prepared him for this sentence. "Cuffs, detective," Claire said. "Please." Callum cuffed the man in silence, hands shaking slightly, adrenaline finally catching up with him now that the danger had passed. Marchetti said nothing, his professional composure returning even in defeat, eyes flicking once toward Claire with something that might have been grudging respect. "Wraith 6, he said quietly, almost to himself. "Didn't think that call sign was real." Claire didn't answer him. She stood, straightened her scrubs, and looked down the stairwell toward the door that led back to the ER, back to Whitfield's office, back to a truth about her father that was about to reshape everything she thought she knew about the last 6 years of her life. "He's secure," she said to Callum. "Get him processed. I need to see Voss. Need to see—" She left the detective standing in the stairwell with a captured contractor and an expression on his face that looked for the first time like genuine humility. By the time Claire reached Whitfield's office, Agent Priya Kessler was standing beside Voss exactly where she'd left them. A laptop open on the desk showing a redacted federal file with Claire's old service photograph in the corner. "Marcus called me 6 days ago," Kessler said, without preamble. "I've spent that time confirming what he found. And—" Claire's voice was steady, but her hands, for the first time since the ambulance bay doors had opened 3 hours earlier, were not. Kessler turned the laptop toward her. A grainy surveillance photograph. A man, older, thinner, gray-bearded, but with a jawline and a posture that Claire would have recognized anywhere, in any lighting after any number of years. "Taken 11 days ago," Kessler said. A black site, decommissioned on paper, still operational off the books. Your father has been held there for 6 years. The unit that authorized the mission that captured him buried the after-action report, rather than admit the operation should never have been greenlit. Marcus found the report. That's why Marchetti was sent. Not for you, for the file. Claire stared at the photograph until the room seemed to tilt slightly around her. 6 years of silence. 6 years of a folded flag that was never actually his. 6 years of building a life around a grave that didn't exist. "Is he alive right now?" she asked. Her voice cracked, just slightly. The first crack anyone in that hospital had seen all day. "As of 11 days ago. Yes," Kessler said. "I won't promise you tomorrow. But yes." "How did this happen? How does a colonel just disappear off the books for 6 years and nobody ever comes looking?" Kessler's expression tightened. The look of someone who'd spent 6 days uncovering an answer she didn't enjoy giving. Because the mission that captured him was never authorized through proper channels. Somebody wanted a result badly enough to skip the paperwork that would have made it accountable. When it went wrong, the easiest thing to do was let it stay buried. A missing colonel from an unauthorized operation is a scandal. A dead colonel from a tragic accident is a Tuesday. They chose the version that made the fewest phone calls. And nobody looked for 6 years? "People looked," Kessler said, quietly. Marcus looked longer and harder than anyone. But looking quietly for a man who officially never went anywhere doesn't move very fast. It took him this long to find someone willing to hand over the file instead of burying it deeper. Voss looked down at his hands, and for the first time since he'd walked through the ER doors, imposing and untouchable, he looked simply tired. "I should have pushed harder years ago. I told myself I was protecting you from false hope. Maybe I was protecting myself from having to watch your face if I turned out to be wrong." "You weren't wrong," Claire said quietly. "You're here. That's more than anyone else did in 6 years." Whitfield, standing near the window, cleared his throat gently. "Nurse Donovan, I think you should sit down." Claire didn't sit down. She stood very straight, the posture she'd spent 3 years unlearning back in place like it had never left, and looked at Kessler. "What happens now?" "Now," Kessler said, "the file goes to people who can't bury it a second time. A retrieval operation gets planned, properly this time, with oversight. And you have a decision to make, because Marcus tells me you're the only person alive who knows the terrain those photographs were taken in, as well as your father does. You want me back in?" "I want to offer you the chance," Kessler said. "Nobody's ordering you to do anything. You've built a life here. You save people here, every day, in ways most of my operators couldn't manage under a tenth of the pressure I watched on that stairwell camera 20 minutes ago." She paused. "But if you want in, I can make it happen. Quietly. On your terms." Claire looked out the glass wall of the office, down at the parking lot, where an ambulance was pulling away, lights dark, no emergency left to chase. She thought of the young man in Bay 1, breathing steady now, heart beating properly for the first time in an hour. Alive, because she hadn't let 3 years of hiding cost him his life when it mattered. She thought of her father's handwriting. Trust the people who earn it slowly. She turned to Callum, who was still standing near the doorway, quiet for once, his earlier bluster entirely gone. "Detective," she said, "I owe you an apology, of a kind. I let you believe I was less than I was, because it was easier than explaining. That wasn't fair to you." Callum shook his head slowly. "No, I owe you the apology. 3 years I called you Fetch It Donovan. 3 years I never once asked what you actually knew how to do." He looked down at his own hands, at the cuff still hanging from his belt, at the memory of pointing a weapon at a decorated combat veteran because she was quiet and wore scrubs, and he'd assumed quiet meant powerless. Respect isn't supposed to be about rank or badge, or how loud somebody talks in a hallway. I forgot that today. I won't forget it again. "No," Claire said, "you won't." Ansari appeared in the doorway a moment later, having finally handed off his patient to the cardiothoracic team that arrived 20 minutes too late to matter, thanks to a nurse who hadn't waited for permission to save a life. He looked at Claire with something between awe and quiet gratitude. "He's stable," Ansari said. "Heading to the OR for definitive repair. He's going to make it, because of you." "Because of both of us," Claire said. "You kept your head. That's not nothing." Ansari smiled, tired, but genuine. I don't know what you are, Claire Donovan, but whatever it is, this hospital is lucky to have had it, even hidden. Maria pushed the door open a crack, having clearly been hovering in the hallway for the last several minutes, unable to stay away. Is it true? She asked. What people are saying downstairs, that you're some kind of, I don't even know what word to use. Combat controller, Claire said. Retired. Mostly. Maria's eyes were bright, somewhere between tears and disbelief. 3 years. 3 years I trained you on IV placement like you'd never held a needle before in your life. You trained me on hospital IV placement, Claire said gently. That part was true. I really didn't know how this building worked when I started. But everything else was real too, Claire said. Just a different kind of real than the one you were looking at. Maria let out a short, disbelieving laugh, somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement. You're going to have to explain a lot of things to a lot of people. You know that, right? I know, Claire said, but not tonight. Claire looked around the small office, at Whitfield, still shaken but standing straighter than before, at Callum, humbled in a way that might actually last, at Voss, who had walked into an ordinary Tuesday and cracked it wide open with 4 whispered words, at Kessler, waiting patiently with a laptop that held both a devastating truth and the first real hope Claire had felt in 6 years. I'll go, Claire said finally. Not because someone's making me, because he's my father, and because I spent 3 years telling myself invisible was safer, and I'm done believing that. She looked at Ansari. I'll need someone to cover my shifts. Ridgeview will manage, Whitfield said. Go bring your father home, Nurse Donovan, or whatever we're supposed to call you now. Claire allowed herself the smallest smile, the first unguarded one anyone at that hospital had ever seen. Claire's fine. It always was. She followed Kessler and Voss out of the office, out past the nurses' station where Maria stood watching her go with an expression somewhere between pride and disbelief, past Bay 1 where a young stranger breathed steady and alive because of hands that used to hold a rifle and now held a needle with the same unshaking precision, past the ER doors that had burst open 3 hours earlier and changed everything. Outside, the evening had gone quiet. The parking lot lit gold by the setting sun, the dark sedan long since towed away with its unconscious passenger. At the edge of the lot, Callum caught up with her, hands in his pockets. Looking younger somehow than he had all shift, the anger finally drained out of him and replaced with something more honest. For what it's worth, he said, I hope you find him. Your father. Thank you, Claire said. And Donovan. He hesitated, searching for the right words, the kind of search that didn't come naturally to him. Whatever happens next, this hospital's better with you in it. I mean that. Claire nodded, something loosening in her chest that had been tight for longer than she'd let herself admit. I'll be back, she said, one way or another. Callum watched her walk to Kessler's car, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't see a quiet nurse who fetched paperwork without complaint. He saw exactly who had been standing in front of him the entire time and understood, a little late, but not too late, that he should have looked closer from the beginning. Claire Donovan walked into that lot with her shoulders straight and her head up. Not because a title told her to, but because she had finally stopped pretending she was someone smaller than herself. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen for who they really are. Some people build entire careers convincing the world they're less than what they carry inside. But the truth has a way of finding its moment, usually right when someone needs saving, and there's nobody else left in the room who knows how. Respect isn't given by a uniform or a title, or how loudly someone talks in a hallway. It's earned in the quiet moments nobody's watching, and it reveals itself the instant it's needed most. Somewhere, hours from now, on a road Claire hadn't driven in years, a car would carry her back toward a version of herself she'd buried under 3 years of soft shoulders and long sleeves. She wasn't afraid of that version anymore. She never should have been. The end. If this story moved you, hit like and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. If you haven't already, subscribe to Secrets of Silent Badges, because next week we've got another quiet hero with a past nobody saw coming. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.